Upon arriving in Prague, I was very eager to get out into this new and unfamiliar European culture and experience it for myself. Before going to Prague, I knew very little about the culture and way of life in Central Europe, and I just assumed that it would be similar to the way of life in the US. I certainly did not do enough research to have any understanding of what the Czech culture really was. Within the first few days of being in Prague, we were told all about how important it was to immerse ourselves in the local culture, and I made this a goal of mine. Looking back at my first week in Prague, I might have thought I was experiencing the new culture, but in reality, I kept myself surrounded by my American peers in the tourist locations around Prague. I went to class and took notes, but in reality, this was not much different than what I did back home. While I knew how important history to a culture is, it wasn't until my weekend trip to Vienna that I realized how much an understanding of a culture's history can help with immersion into that culture. During my first few hours in Vienna, my friends and I went on a free walking tour that was offered by our hostel. Charles, our brilliant tour guide, showed us everything from historic buildings to traditional restaurants. I remember being amazed when Charles pointed out a building and casually stated that the famous musician Mozart used to live there. While my whole life history seemed to bore me, it was suddenly very interesting to me simply because I was there. It was real. While still important, the history of the United States does not compare to that of Vienna, Prague, or anywhere else in Central Europe, so I had never experienced anything like this. Maybe the most fascinating aspect of the tour were all the World War II references. The moment I was standing in a place in which Hitler once gave a speech to hundreds of thousands of people, I realized how important history is to a place's culture. While I was only there for a weekend, I was not able to fully immerse myself in the culture of Vienna. However, I left feeling like I did a good job of experiencing the culture as best I could in that short time, thanks to the tour. I also realized that not only is the history important to the people within that culture, that of course is obvious, but it became important to me to understand because of how it changed my perspective. Luckily, Vienna was my first weekend trip while abroad, and I was able to take what I learned and apply it to my other trips as well as the host culture in Prague. There was suddenly a much deeper meaning to all the cultural differences that I was experiencing thus far in my short time in Europe. And suddenly I was able to better place myself in the shoes of a local and therefore have a better overall understanding of their culture. This also allowed me to empathize with the local culture to the best of my ability, which we later learned was a good way to suppress stereotypes. As I stated before, I was very eager to immerse myself in the Prague culture. However, before Vienna, I was unsure of how to achieve that. My classes that I originally chose for the strict purpose to get credits for graduation now became my bridge to real cultural immersion. Specifically, it made me realize how the material I was learning in my other classes, such as history of the Czech lands as well as my art history classes, applies to the present day culture in Prague. Suddenly, field trips to the Prague castle and going to dinner with friends became more than just fun outings. They were an opportunity to learn even more about the host culture. After my change in perspective, each trip out of my apartment felt like another step to a real, meaningful cultural immersion. All it took was a 2 hour tour with a local guy named Charles to change my perspective on my entire experience and realize what it took to immerse myself as much as possible into an unfamiliar culture. I found that with a deeper understanding of the background of the culture, I was immediately more confident to step outside of my comfort zone. Whether it was trying new foods or having the courage to attempt to speak Czech at the grocery store, I found myself wanting to experience more and more. This trip to Vienna was a critical moment in my time abroad as it made me realize that it takes more than just living somewhere for a few months to understand their culture. It takes a deeper understanding. While unfortunately our time was cut short abroad and I do not feel as though I was able to achieve the level of cultural experience that I wanted to, I certainly learned a lot about the correct steps in order to achieve a beyond surface level experience. I am confident that the places that I saw and the experiences that I had progressed me as a personal leader in the world. And the next time I get the chance to experience a brand new culture, whether it be a meal at a foreign restaurant or moving to a new country, I will make the conscious effort to learn the history of the culture in order to give myself a good head start.